Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today, we actually have a rough one to talk about, but we need to talk about the STOP CSAM Act. Now, if you don't know what CSAM is, it's child sexual abuse material. And quite frankly, nobody wants this on the internet except those that perpetrate it. I just have to say that right out of the gate, because we have to talk about the nuts and bolts of this act, but we also have to balance it with the rights of ordinary citizens. And the vast majority of us, the 99.9999% of us, are not actually sharing or doing anything when it comes to abusing children, right? So we have to talk about that. And obviously, I'm going to give you my preamble here too, which is cybersecurity is agnostic from politics, but we're not immune from it. And so let's dive into this, because digital right groups are urging basically U.S. Senate leaders not to move forward with a bill that would impose new regulations on companies around CSAM, arguing that the legislation would be a privacy nightmare for ordinary Americans. So, in a letter addressed to Senate Judiciary Committee leaders, Senator Chuck Grassley, he's a Republican of Iowa, and Senator Dick Durbin, the Democrat of Illinois, who is the minority leader on there, the groups, which include, for the record, the ACLU, the Freedom of Press Foundation, Defending Rights and Dissent, and Roots Action, they're all saying basically that the STOP CSAM Act, which was reintroduced this past May, is, quote, walks back a number of important privacy protections that had been included in a previous version of the bill, end quote. The letter also reads, and I quote, and bear with me here because it's a longer quote, the current bill creates enormous incentives for platforms to stop offering encrypted services that are critical for enabling all of us to have private conversations and securely store files from our most personal moments, like photos from a child's birthday. While all of our groups want to stop the harmful transmission of child sexual abuse material, CSAM, its transmission is already illegal, and these modifications to the bill do nothing more than undermine privacy and security, end quote. So with that, let's actually talk about what's in this act right now and what it actually does, because on the surface, it actually sounds great, and I'm going to dive into this. And so with that, let's dive into some of the nuts and bolts here, because the STOP CSAM Act would impose new requirements on companies to prevent the hosting and distribution of CSAM on their platforms. And on the surface, that sounds great. I don't think anybody would disagree with that reasonably. It basically expands companies' legal obligations by requiring them to report instances of such material on their sites to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Again, I don't have a problem with that on the surface. It also introduces stricter privacy protections for children who testify in court. Big fan of that. Additionally, it would require businesses with more than 1 million unique monthly visitors, think Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, etc., or basically $50 million in annual revenue, again, we're talking big tech, to submit annual reports to the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice. Not really complaining about that either, right? On the surface, it sounds great. It would also seek, and this is interesting, to alter immunity under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I've written articles on this, etc., etc. I'm pro Section 230 until we get something better. But anyway, it would seek to alter these for, and I quote, interactive computer services, end quote, thus allowing victims to file civil lawsuits against companies that fail to remove CSAM content from their platforms in a timely fashion. Again, on the surface, that sounds great. Now, the bill includes language specifying that, and I quote again, any person who is a victim of the intentional, knowing, or reckless hosting or storing of child pornography or making child pornography available to any person by a provider of an interactive computer service and who suffers personal injury as a result of such hosting, storing, or making available, regardless of when the injury occurred, may bring a civil action, end quote. And again, on the surface, that sounds good, but how are you defining a victim? So, as I mentioned, all of that, and that's the nuts and bolts of it, seem reasonable, but let's dive a tad deeper into this, because those digital right groups that I mentioned, like the ACLU, etc., before, are saying that this new version of legislation includes quote-unquote recklessness as a legal standard for liability, and and by applying it to any, quote, interactive computer service, end quote, the legislation would capture virtually all applications that rely on end-to-end encryption. Meaning you have an app, think like Signal, for example, where it's encrypted on your phone, and as you are sending, let's say, a message, whether it's just benign or innocuous or illegal to another user, it's encrypted in transit across the internet and then encrypted into that user's device as well. So by virtue of that, that in turn could open up providers of, let's say, the Signals of the world to civil lawsuits for hosting material that they can't actually view without breaking the encryption of their users. Signal very famously, and again, this goes to Signal, Telegram, you name the application, but Signal is one of the big ones here. Basically, Signal famously states they can't see anything. It's end-to-end. They don't store data. They don't store telemetry to the best of their ability. So when they get a subpoena from, let's say, a court anywhere around the world, they can't really produce that, because if I send you a message on Signal or vice versa, it's end-to-end. Signal itself can't actually see it. So basically, India McKinney of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF, said, and I quote, "The bill goes much further than current law and threatens to punish any service that works to keep its users secure, including those that do their best to limit and report CSAM. The bill applies to, quote, interactive computer services, end quote, which broadly includes private messaging and email apps, social media platforms, cloud storage providers, and many other internet intermediaries and online service providers," end quote. And that's exactly the point here, right? I mean, that's what we are talking about. There's a lot of us, the vast majority of us, are not doing illegal things. So why are we giving up our right to privacy for the 0.001% that are? But it's not clear whether these groups' warnings are going to have any influence on Congress at all. Politically speaking, obviously forcing private companies to do more to counter anything that regards child abuse on their platforms and websites is very popular with the public. Again, on the surface, if you're hearing we're doing more to stop, child abuse in any way, shape, or form online, who's not going to disagree with that? And online child safety is a top issue for congressional Republicans who control both houses of Congress. And yeah, it should be a top issue for everybody, but how we actually do that while balancing the rights of American citizens is an important one. So Senator Grassley is basically not known as a strong advocate of unrestricted encryption. He previously led a bipartisan congressional effort in 2018 to develop legislation that would have compelled companies to grant law enforcement access to encrypted communications and investigations, therefore breaking or adding backdoors into their own encryption. I talked about that actually in 2018 right here on this podcast as well. That's how long I've been doing this, actually longer than that. So my take on this. And it's my take on this has been the take when I talked about this back in 2018 with Senator Grassley and his previous work, is that we cannot build laws to the lowest common denominator. So think about it this way. Lowest common denominator simply means that if we are making laws to catch the criminals, which again are the vast minority of the population, whatever that crime is, we basically jeopardize potentially our rights for this. Law enforcement has always had to deal with encryption of various types throughout its history, in centuries and centuries and centuries before the internet was even a thing. Think about it this way. You can go back 100 years, you can go back 500 years. A thief or even a predator could store their materials in a really good safe that would require cracking. Right? In the same way that you'd have to break into a phone, to retrieve whatever negative materials or criminal materials they have. This has been going on for centuries. Criminal enterprises have always used code words, both verbally and in writing, as, to obfuscate their true messages. I mean, look at any mob movie you've got. The Sopranos, Goodfellas, whatever, they know law enforcement's watching. So they're not talking about, let's go murder whoever. They'll use code words. They'll speak in private. It's always been a cat and mouse game. And now that we've moved online and we are communicating and generating way more data than any generation previously has, law enforcement absolutely wants to make it easier. Imagine if they went to every safe company and said, you know what, you have basically a combination that the end user, the purchaser of the safe can use, but we always want to backdoor into this. And by virtue of that, every safe is not as secure as you think it is. these are things that are serious issues. And if they are breaking, that kind of encryption where basically they can data mine anything, then you're also potentially looking at what an authoritarian government can do. So encryption standards and systems in China, for example, they have backdoors into everything. Nothing is truly end-to-end encrypted when it's going through Chinese infrastructure, because the Chinese government requires access to all of that. So if we start breaking encryption, then governments around the world start acting like authoritarians, whether they are or not, because now they can just simply say, we're going to short circuit an actual investigation and go straight to data, and maybe we're caught up. I've talked about geofence warrants where they go to Google and say, hey, show me everybody in this geographical region that's basically Googled XYZ or an address or something, and now I'm potentially caught up in that because I'm in that region and I happen to Google something that the actual murderer or thief or whatever did. This is what we're talking about. This is not something that we take very lightly, and nobody wants to see abuse of children or even adults, I would hope, on the internet. But nevertheless, we've always had this cat and mouse, and we've always ensured that our right to privacy is something that's been sacrosanct under the U.S. Constitution. And if we're getting rid of that, that's a huge flipping problem, right? So we're going to see where this goes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But again, cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. Nobody wants to see crime actually happen. Look at the dark web. Nobody wants that around. But nevertheless, we shouldn't have to trample on individual rights, and law enforcement should do their job and continue to gumshoe it around as they have for literally centuries, and actually find the criminals without basically intruding on our privacy. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, where nothing is end-to-end encrypted. Same with YouTube as well. They know what you're watching. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, secure, and informed. Take care.